Hi everyone, hope you are well. I'm back with a game analysis. If this is the first video that you're watching on my channel, welcome. What you can expect from this game analysis is I'm going to walk you through one of my more recent over the board games. I'm going to explain my thought process, show you some variations, talk a little bit about the opening, about some strategy stuff. So if that sounds interesting, let's get into it. My opponent started with e4, to which I responded with e6. This is commonly known as the French defense, and if you've ever seen me play on Twitch, by the way, follow me on Twitch, you will know that the French defense is one of my favorite openings. I play it all the time. It brings me a lot of joy to be talking about it today. Now, the most common move for white here is to play d4, which makes a lot of sense. White is just going to take over the center since black didn't make that strong of a claim with e6. This is not what my opponent had in mind for me today. Not today. 3 days ago. Instead, they played b3, which is not bad, it's just not considered as ambitious as other moves that white could play against the French. Now, the intention behind this move is to fianchetto the bishop, right? But we don't really know much more than that. Are they going to play d3? Are they going to play d4? We don't know. Let's find out. So I continued with d5, my opponent played bishop d2, and here I play knight f6. Now, if you're thinking, well, why didn't I just take the free pawn? That's a fair question. The short answer is that yes, you can take that pawn, it's playable, but keep in mind that oftentimes in openings like this, when your opponent just sacrifices a pawn, seemingly out of nowhere, they might be doing it not as a mistake, but for the following reason. They either know that they are going to recuperate the pawn in a short matter of time. So you can think about the Queen's Gambit, for example, where after something like d4, d5, c4, it seems like, well, black can just take the pawn for free, but then white ends up taking it back in a few moves anyway. Or another thing that can happen is that you might be trying so hard to guard that pawn on e4 or wherever once you've taken it, then you might be weakening and compromising your position in other ways. So you can take the pawn, but keep in mind it's not exactly for free. Your opponent can get a lot of compensation through the inherent piece activity that you get while they're developing and you're busy guarding your pawn. And honestly, that's not really my vibe. So I went for knight f6. But if that sounds like your thing, definitely go for pawn takes e4. Now after knight f6, they pushed e5. I retreated, and here they played another move that really got me like, what is going on? And they played queen h5. And you might be thinking, whoa, what a blunder. They moved their queen out so early in the game. They haven't even developing their pieces. And while I applaud you for knowing the opening principles, if you haven't realized this already, you are prone to realize it very, very soon, which is that all these rules, all these strategy rules that we humans have made about chess, they always have exceptions, right? Because at the end of the day, chess is about calculation, chess is precise, chess is deterministic, right? So if something is breaking all rules, of course, strategy rules, not the rules of how to play the game, but if something is breaking all strategy rules, but it is working from a precise point of view, then it's not really breaking the rules. Sorry to say it. So since I don't really have a clear way to punish white for bringing their queen out to h5, then there's nothing really wrong with this move. It's just a little bit, well, why would you do that? But, well, why would you do that? I guess my opponent was thinking that once I'll play g6 to kick out the queen, then I will have committed to fianchettoing this bishop here, or at least weakening some of the dark squares on the king side. I think that's what they had in mind. So baiting me into playing g6 so that they just pull the queen down a couple squares, and I have committed for the rest of the game to having pushed a g-pawn. I didn't fall for it yet. I played c5, f4, And now I went for it. G6, they retreated, bishop G7. I thought, well, might as well fianchetto the bishop since I've played G6. They went knight f3. I also developed. They also developed. And here I played a6. And the reason I played a6 is because I was thinking, well, d6 is another square that is kind of weak as a consequence of my pawn structure. So maybe if I play something like d4, or not even, if I just play anything, they might go knight b5 and then put the knight on d6, and it's gonna be really hard for me to kick that knight out of d6. And I also had the second reason for playing a6, which is to play b5. Because since white has kind of expanded more on the king side, and I think from the way they put their pawn structure, it definitely seems like what they're cooking here is a king side attack. It kind of makes sense to me to start making some progress on the other side of the board, to kind of bring some balance into the game. Now, after a6, they went bishop e2. I played b5, and they short castled. And at this moment, I had the first really long think of the game, because on one hand, I wanted to just quickly castle, like, easy, intuitive move to make. It's pretty much the last thing that I have to do here after having developed most of my pieces. But something in me was warning me that looks dangerous. Queen here, knight here, pawns. It just there's something off about it. And once I started thinking about it, I kind of discovered what might be wrong with it. And yeah, I was glad I didn't jump into castling. So after short castling, by the way, if you want to think about it yourself, just pause the video. White can play knight g5. And knight g5, well, threatens checkmate. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, I can just play h6. And you can. But then you would painfully discover that knight g5 wasn't just threatening checkmate. It was actually also setting up a tactical opportunity for white. Pause the video if you want to figure it out yourself. Hopefully you did. Knight takes e6. Knight takes e6, and if the pawn takes, the queen jumps in with a check and with an attack on the knight on c6. So at the end of this line, white basically wins 2 pawns because they sacked their knight for 2 pawns, but then they're taking back their knight. And my king looks weak. These pawns are maybe coming. This just seems like a very, very bad situation to be in. Now, instead of short castling, I probably could have played h6, and that would have been totally fine. So play h6 and later on short castle. I took a more radical approach. I was like, you know what? I don't want to be like worrying all the time about getting attacked, so I'm just gonna do my best to close the position. And I played f5. Now, the obvious drawback of f5 is that the pawn on e6 might become weak, right? Now, white cannot easily attack it, or at least not for the time being, because if they go something like knight g5, I can just guard it with queen e7 at least. But it is something to keep in mind, especially since white decided to take en passant. And now we can see a direct attack on the pawn on e6, but more generally speaking, this is a pawn that cannot be guarded by other pawns, cannot push easily because white's guarding stuff. And it's on a half-open file, which means that white is going to be able to line up their heavy pieces against the pawn. It's not critical, but it is something to keep in mind. And more generally speaking, whenever the pawn structure changes, ideally beforehand, but okay, even after the pawn structure changes, you should assess how that change impacted your strengths and your weaknesses. And the same thing for your opponent. Now, I took back with the knight. I kind of had to because pawn was attacked, so now the bishop is guarding. They continued with knight e5, attacking my knight. I went knight d4. Now, here, I was kind of hoping that they would go with the bishop on d3. So the knight's attacking the pawn, and it's also maybe attacking the bishop, not immediately because the knight's guarded. But maybe I'd just trade, or maybe I'd push b4, removing the defender, and then trying to take on e2. And I was thinking that after they played bishop d3, I would push c4, and I was quite happy with this. Computer doesn't think it's that big of a deal, but well, what does he know, right? Instead, my opponent played bishop d1, and this seemed a little bit passive. There's nothing like immediately wrong with it. It just seems kind of awkward to cut the connection between your rooks like that. So when you have to make a move that is a little bit like suspicious, aesthetically speaking, maybe just give yourself like 30 more seconds to really check that that's the move that you want to go for. Of course, ugly moves or aesthetically displeasing moves can very often be good because, like we discussed before, there is no rule in chess that is more important than pure calculation. But just saying, oftentimes when a move looks a little bit iffy, chances are there's a reason for that. Now, after bishop d1, I short castled finally. They went knight e2. I decided to keep things simple and just trade. And after trades, I developed my queen, maybe setting up a little bit of a trap, but that would have had to be really, really lucky because if they played bishop d3, then c4 wins a piece, right? So didn't think they were going to fall for this, but a little bit of a bonus to just developing my queen. Instead, they went d3, and here I played d4. And what I had in mind when I played d4 was, well, my bishop on c8 is kind of a passive piece. It's just waiting around, either to be taken or just, I don't know, it's waiting to find the purpose in life. So if I play d4, I might be giving it a little bit of purpose by putting it on b7 and then on this long diagonal. And I might even trade bishops because I think it's better to trade for a decent piece of my opponent, so that light squared bishop, then just keep my bishop on c8 passive indefinitely. But after they played bishop f3, I realized, well, I can't play bishop b7, at least not immediately. And the reason for that, well, I wish I hadn't put the arrows because I wanted to suggest another pause the video and figure it out yourself, but I forgot that I had the arrows already added. So, well, anyway, the queen is overloaded, right? The queen is guarding both the pawn and the bishop at the same time, which means that after bishop takes, queen takes e6 check, white wins a pawn. And we don't want that. So I went rook a7. And I realized that, well, it's not that big of a deal that I moved my rook, because later on this rook might actually enjoy some increased mobility. Maybe I'll double up somewhere. So it's not like there's a pawn on b7 and my rook is just awkwardly trapped on a7. It's actually quite a nice position there on a7. Now white brought the rook in the middle. I played queen d6, just thought that, well, queen's not really doing anything on b6, so let's bring her closer to the center. And here my opponent played c4. And c4 is problematic. It is not like, a complete mistake, but it is making white's position a little bit worse. Now, the correct move from me here was to take on c3, which I did because, gotta love taking en passant. How often does it happen? Now, after taking en passant, white also has a weak pawn on d3. So before, I had a weakness on e6 that isn't that obvious because it's well protected, but it could become a target at any point. But by allowing me to take on c3, white has done the same thing to their position. So now the pawn on d3 is not being protected by any other pawn. It's isolated. It doesn't have any neighbors, right? It cannot push easily. And it is on a half-open file where I could try to bring my heavy pieces and put pressure on it. Not right now, not in this very moment, but at some point. Now, one thing that I would want to note here, this is kind of what you shouldn't do here. What you shouldn't do here is you shouldn't push b4. And you might be tempted to push b4 because it seems or it feels like you're making progress, right? Because you're pushing your pawn forwards. But unfortunately, what you're really doing is you're locking down the queen side. You're making it really hard for yourself to come with a plan later on. So what is there left to do on the queen side afterwards? Push a5, push a4, take on b3. That's good, but it's not achieving that much because you can't even like go with the rook and try to take the pawn that easily. And if you just push, push, and push, well, that's pretty much the end of the journey for that pawn. And the reason it's so bad to block the queen side is because this way you are giving white a free hand on the king side. So we discussed more in the beginning of the game how white has concentrated their efforts on the king side. They haven't done so much in the past moves, but the key elements are still there. So the queen, the advanced pawns, the central knight, the rooks, all these elements are still here ready to create an attack. And if you lock down the queen side, this means that not much is happening on the queen side. Therefore, most of the stuff is happening on the king side, and that's where your opponent wants the play to be driven. That's where they think they have the upper hand. So that's working more in their advantage than in yours. And more generally speaking, when your opponent is attacking you on a side of the board, of course you want to defend, right, to what they're attacking. But just as importantly, you want to have some breakthroughs for yourself. And that's either a breakthrough in the middle of the board, so they attack on the side, you break in the middle and open up the position. Not really the case here. Or they attack on the side, you attack on the other side of the board. And basically you have a race of whose attack reaches its target first. And if you block the queen side, then you've pretty much lost the race, which puts you in a position where you're just passively defending, and maybe you're gonna hold, maybe you're not. I think most people prefer playing offensively than defensively anyway. So b4, not a good idea. Don't lock down the position because then it becomes really hard to come up with a subsequent plan. Now, take as en passant, they took with the bishop, and now I play knight d5. And knight d5 is a cool move because it's attacking both the pawn on f4 and the bishop. And if the bishop goes back to d2, that's not really helping because the pawn on f4 is still hanging. Because I also have the rook. Which means that white still had to take with the bishop. I took back with the pawn, opening up this bishop. They played queen g3, and now, for the second time in this game, I played d4. Same idea, maybe I'll put the bishop on b7, but actually with an extra idea, which is the kind of thing that you become aware of from a strategical point of view, even though you know that you're not going to be able to implement it soon, which is that if I manage to play c4, I get rid of the d3 pawn, which means that my d pawn is going to become a passer, and that's going to be really useful for an endgame. So basically what I was hoping to play towards here, and I'm saying I was hoping because the game took a crazy turn and we never got to see any of these plans, but what I was working towards here was play a5, play a4, weaken the b3 pawn, maybe just keep the tension, and then also prepare for c4 so that when we trade, the d pawn becomes a passed pawn. By the way, if I haven't mentioned this already, so a passed pawn is a pawn that doesn't have a pawn in front of it or neighbors. So you can imagine this pawn as being able to freely push without being stopped by any of the opponent's pawns. Now I developed the bishop, and here white played h4 and offered a draw. And this was a very interesting moment for me because my heart was telling me that I don't want to draw here. This is an interesting position. I want to see where it goes, with a little asterisk of I think I can win. From an objective point of view, this position is, at least according to the computer, which is known as the objective guy around here, this position is 0-0. So my opponent actually had a fair point when they offered a draw. Now, while my heart was telling me that I should keep playing because this game is interesting and I could win it, my brain was like, well, yeah, but what are you gonna do about h5? h5 looks scary. And the reason it looks scary is because it puts you in an awkward position where you either take and open up the g file, or you let them take you and the very least lose the g6 pawn. So I think h4 is a very nice practical move. Now, of course, the computer is like, you should take a chill pill. You should not worry, because after a5, do your stuff with a4, weakening b3, and if they play h5, don't care, just take. And of course, when you know that you have the backing of the computer, all of a sudden it doesn't seem so scary, because the rook can jump in, the king can shelter, but practically speaking, at least for me, this seemed like a very hard decision to make, to just take on h5, because it's counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive to just open your king. But, well, this was possible. Instead, after my heart and my brain had this like whole battle where I was sure I was gonna keep on playing. Like, I was like, I gotta know what happens at the end of this game. This cannot be how the game ends. We wouldn't have had this video either, so there's that. But the brain persuaded me into being super scared of h5, so I played rook f5 with the intention of chopping the pawn off h5 with the rook if it pushes forwards. Now, white play knight f3, and they're probably planning some like knight maneuver to g5 and then e4. And I realized that I never really got to do anything with my rook on a7, so might as well just put it on a8 so that I don't have to worry about checks on the back rank. White playing knight g5, bishops attacked, so I moved it, and here they played h5. And h5, I thought that it wasn't working. I was actually kind of rooting for this move, because when I play h6, what I thought was, well, the knight's gonna move somewhere, and then I'm just gonna take the pawn with the rook, just like I planned. And after knight e4, which was played in the game, of course I can't take first because the queen's hanging, so bishop takes, pawn takes. It's a blunder, but don't let that fool you. Rook takes h5, I'm a pawn up, right? And of course, game is still complicated, we're gonna see. But white has those scary f and e pawns, and I have the passed pawn on the d file that, especially in an endgame, that pawn is gonna be a killer. Because also c4 is coming, connected passed pawns. I was feeling good about this, but also scared about this middle pawns that white has. Now, pawn takes e4 is a blunder, and it took me so long to kind of understand why. And I feel like if my opponent had realized why, then they really would have deserved to win the game, because they would have proved a better understanding of the situation than mine. Now, while pawn takes e4 is the most intuitive, you bring the pawn, you want to push it forwards, right? Taking with the rook is actually the way to go, because if I carry on taking here, which I would have 100%, after rook f to e1, all of a sudden white has a lot of activity, and in fact they take back their pawn, because rook e6 is a threat, right? And then the pawn on g6 is gonna hang, and there's just no way for me to stop this. My rook on h5 is in kind of an awkward spot. I would have to bring it back to f5, and all in all, I cannot stop rook e6, which means I'm losing the pawn on g6, which means I'm no longer a pawn up. So what was this whole thing for then? But they took with the pawn, I took there, I'm a pawn up, they went e5, queen e6 to block the pawn, queen f3 attacks the rook, and now my opponent went g4. And g4 here looks really scary. Like I was intimidated. Now, don't let yourselves be fooled by the fact that the leech's analysis is showing the double question mark to this move or the blunder icon or whatever, because this move, it looks really scary. Like on one hand, it's not very clear where you're supposed to be moving this rook. It seems, at least when you first think about it, that h4 is the only square that you could go to. But also, it seems that this move is enabling f5 for white, and then once that happens, f6 can happen. Sorry, f6, e6. Like white pawns just can. It seems like they can just start snowballing towards you. So I had to have a really hard thing here, pretty much burn through like all the time that I had left in order to figure this out. Now, the first move that I had in mind was rook h4, because like I said, it's the obvious safe square for the rook. You're threatening the pawn on g4. And now after f5, I was like, oh my god, this looks scary. Hopefully I will survive. Computer doesn't think it's that big of a deal. Like it just says, well, just go back to d7, and then if e6, then you can just block the pawn again, and then f6 is pretty much never going to happen because you're guarding it with like 3 pieces, and now you're also guarding the rook. And if they try to push this way, well, they blundered the pawn on g4, and the bishop is not yet in danger because of the pin. But you know, it's easier said than done, and you feel way more comfortable with such a line where you have the engine bar to kind of back you up on it. And this can also very easily go wrong for black. For example, if you take first, this is already really bad, because once they take back and you retreat, whatever, now after something like queen g3, the queen is attacking the rook, and all of a sudden the pawn is no longer pinned, which means that after something like rook h5, f6 is coming, and black is losing at least a bishop here. So of course I didn't play the best moves for either side here, but you can see how easily you can get in trouble by playing pretty much you know, intuitive natural moves such as taking on f5. Now, instead of playing rook h4, I kept on thinking here, and I realized, well, maybe there is another way to use the pawn on the pin on this pawn, right? And another thing that comes to mind is taking the pawn on e5. And once I saw this option, I was like, wait, maybe this position is not as bad as it seems, or as bad as I initially thought. Now, the idea of rook takes e5 is if the pawn takes, then we take the queen, they take back, and you might be thinking, well, stop analyzing, black won the queen, but don't forget that white also has 2 rooks, so materially speaking, black is only a pawn up, right? Because we've got queen for 2 rooks, and then black has an extra pawn. Thankfully, black can also win this pawn. The king's out in the open. This guy is a passer. This guy is going to be a passer. This guy is a passer. All these pawns are going to, you know, slowly and patiently, but decisively become very, very dangerous. And the pawn on the e file can be stopped using the bishop. So even though the material imbalance, it's not as crushing as we would have wanted, black's queen and pawns here are just better. Now, instead of taking with the pawn on e5, they can also take with the rook, and you might think, well, yeah, but we just take back and that's it. And I admit that this was the point where I stopped calculating, and it would have been really bad if I had gone for this line without having calculating further, because rook e1 here, it seems really, really scary, because it pretty much seems like you're losing the bishop, and well, computer has just one solution for it, which is to play g5 here. We're not going to get into it, but I do encourage you to pause the video and try to kind of see if you can work out with what's up with this move. But it seems really scary that you're pinned on the e-file like that. But it felt good in this position to kind of know, okay, I could go for rook h4, I could go for rook takes e5. Things are not as bleak as it seems. But this gave me the final idea, a combination between rook h4 attacking the pawn and rook e5 exploiting the pin, and that idea is rook to g5. And rook to g5 is a game saver, game winner. Because we're threatening to take on g4 with a check, right? And then it uses the same idea that if pawn takes rook, we take, we're in a similar position as before. Now we can just take this pawn with a check, or we can even take here first. The idea being that if the bishop takes, now the queen takes, and this is a double attack. So it is very similar to what we had before with rook takes e5, pawn takes e5, rook takes f3, but it's avoiding this whole line of rook e5, bishop e5, rook e1 that is kind of unpleasant. Now, after rook g5, my opponent didn't take, but instead they played the scary move f5. Now, what is really cool about this rook on g5, even though you might be thinking that rook is really not cool because it's literally being attacked by the bishop, but what's really cool about it is that it is pinning this g-pawn, which means that now on f5, I don't have to take with the pawn, which seems kind of bad because after bishop takes, pawn takes, white is an exchange up, right? And they're about to probably win some more material. The right continuation here is actually taking this way to first do a discovered attack and then try to recover the bishop. But instead of taking it with the pawn and leaving this guy to get taken by the bishop, I can take with the rook. And yeah, this is really pretty. Because if the bishop takes the rook, now we take the queen and we're in the same situation as before that we just discussed. And now the queen takes, even better actually, because the bishop's already on g5. So the queen takes, double attack. We're going to be queen bishop versus two rooks, so pretty much a piece up. And the pawn cannot take on f5, which leaves white with two big options. Check with the queen, at which point after king h7, bishop takes g5, rook takes g5, white did win an exchange. So if we look at the pieces left, white did win an exchange, but at a very high price because black has 6 pawns, right? So that's already 2 pawns in return for the exchange, and this pawn on g4 is pretty much lost next move. And then that's gonna put the white king in a very awkward situation. Or white can take the rook with the queen. And this is what my opponent went for in the game. The computer preferred going for the check, but I think from like a human's perspective, maybe just going for the imbalance is a little bit more tempting because at least, you know, there's an imbalance. So they take with the queen. Now we take back. Here is an idea. This can be done. It's still pretty good. I was a little bit intimidated by once again getting him with the pawn so advanced. It seems I didn't have that much to be worried about because I can just try to sack my bishop for one of the pawns. Or for example, if queen d5, f6, I can just keep pushing this guy, not care about the bishop. If they take me, just push again. Which, yeah, I didn't think about, because since I was intimidated by this whole thing with bishop takes, pawn takes f5, I just went for a variation that I felt was winning less material but was a little bit more easily won by me, which was rook takes g4. So now if they move the king, we take the queen and we've kept the rook, so this is very, very bad for white. Therefore, they have to give up the queen. I take back with the check. Now they went here, and even though white has this e-pawn, this can very easily be blocked this way. You just gotta pay attention, you know, not forget about the pawn. And then black has at least 3 pawns that can just push forwards and queen. And here I went for bishop f8, so just to be safe, just to make sure that, you know, kind of put my anxiety to rest, knowing that worst case scenario, worst comes to worst, I just sacrifice my bishop for the pawn and I'm fine. White played rook to g1. I went for the check, and here I think my opponent went for the final mistake. So the problem is that if they go on e2 and they try to run away with the king, then this pawn is loose, right? And this feels really bad for white to lose that pawn, because it almost seems like they're losing their last hope at creating some kind of counterplay in this game. So instead, my opponent went king g3, but this just speed things up towards the end. And pause the video, see if you find the final blow. Congratulations if you pause the video, and thank you for re-clicking the play button. So the move here is queen to d3. We're doing a double attack. We're gonna win the bishop, and then, like I said, even if in the worst case scenario I have to sack the bishop for the pawn, I'm still not even in trouble because I'm winning white's bishop first. Now they went king to h4, and I decided to chase the king a little bit more. So bishop e7 check, king g4, let's go for h5, king f4, g5. The king's trapped, so they have to give up the rook. Bishop takes g5, and here the game ended. Actually, something very funny happened here. You're gonna think this is a little bit crazy, but when I got home and I decided to, analyze the game, I had written down king to f5, so that would be here. And I looked at my score sheet and I was like, I must have like written down the square poorly, because king f5 is obviously impossible, right? I must have meant king takes g5, after which I would have continued with king takes d2 and queen takes e1. But then I was like, wait a second, I remember that we played some more moves and I never got to win the rook for free, and there is no way I wouldn't have seen take the bishop, take the rook. So something else must have happened, and what happened was that my opponent played king f5, and I didn't realize. I was just so fixated on the win and fixated on taking the bishop and taking everything, that this man made an impossible move and I didn't see. I just straight up went and took the bishop. So unfortunately, the rest of the game is impossible to follow here, because both me and my opponent continued from a position of impossibility. So yeah, we're going to officially consider that this was the end of the game. I think it is pretty much a resign time for white, so we're not losing too much by cutting the game short. If you've made it until here, congratulations! You've had the patience for a really long chess analysis video, which tells me that you are really committed to getting better. So, wishing you the best of luck. And obviously, thank you for watching. I would be really interested to know how you found the analysis, what were maybe some things that you found useful, some things that you found interesting. And yeah, any feedback is appreciated. Do consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Do check me out on Twitch, and I will see you all very, very soon. Thank you for watching.